The battered Ford pickup coughed its last breath as Dr. Ethan Blake steered it into the near-deserted main street of Hollow Creek. A sigh escaped him, a mix of exhaustion and a faint, hesitant optimism. He'd left the clamor of the city behind, seeking the quiet solace of a small town, a place to rebuild after a chapter of his life had abruptly closed. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the empty storefronts, and a chill, despite the late summer warmth, settled in his bones. Hollow Creek was a pocket of forgotten America, a scattering of weathered houses nestled in a valley hemmed in by the dense, brooding expanse of the Blackwood Forest. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the creak of the pickup's protesting engine and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. A sign, its paint faded and peeling, announced, "Welcome to Hollow Creek, a peaceful community." Ethan couldn't help but find a certain irony in the word peaceful. There was an underlying tension in the air, a stillness that felt less like tranquility and more like a held breath. He found the sheriff's office, a modest brick building at the end of the street. Inside, Sheriff Brody, a man whose features were as weathered as the town itself, looked up from a stack of paperwork. His eyes, though, were sharp and observant. "Dr. Blake, I presume," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you were coming. Welcome to Hollow Creek." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ethan replied, extending a hand. "I'm looking forward to settling in." "It's quiet here," Brody said, a touch of caution in his tone. "Some folks might find it too quiet." He paused, then added, "Now there are some stories that go around here." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Old legends, mostly. I wouldn't pay them any mind." Ethan, a man of science, arched an eyebrow. "Legends?" "Local folklore." The sheriff waved his hand dismissively, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, just superstition. As dusk deepened, Ethan noticed an unease among the few townsfolk he encountered. They hurried home, casting nervous glances at the darkening forest. He heard a strange, high-pitched whine from the tree line, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Shrugging off the feeling, he chalked it up to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. Still, the image of those nervous townsfolk, the odd sound from the forest, and the sheriff's uneasy demeanor followed him as he made his way to his newly rented old Victorian house at the edge of town. Little did he know how soon he would be forced to question his rational thinking. The old Victorian house, despite its peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards, offered Ethan a semblance of comfort. He unpacked the silence of the house, a stark contrast to the city's ceaseless hum. Yet, even indoors, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, an unsettling awareness that the tranquility of Hollow Creek was a fragile facade. The following morning, Ethan opened his medical practice, a small, sparsely furnished room adjacent to his house. Patients trickled in, each bearing a story of unease. Mrs. Henderson complained of sleepless nights, her eyes wide with a fear Ethan couldn't quite place. Old Mr. Johnson showed him strange scratches on his arms, attributing them to wild animals. Yet his gaze darted nervously towards the forest. He noticed a common thread: fear. It wasn't the fear of illness, but a deeper, more primal dread. The townsfolk whispered about the old ways, about nights when the moon held sway over the land, about a darkness that crept from the depths of Blackwood Forest. Intrigued, Ethan sought out Abigail Weaver, the town's elder. Her house, nestled deeper into the valley, held an air of ancient wisdom. Abigail, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and knowing, welcomed him with a knowing smile. "You seek answers, Doctor," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "Answers that modern medicine cannot provide." She told him of the legend, of the ancient rituals performed by the first settlers, of a pact broken, and of a curse that returned with every full moon. "The Blackwood Forest is old, Doctor," she said, her eyes fixed on his. It remembers, and it does not forgive. As she spoke, a figure stumbled into her yard. It was Caleb Holt, a young man Ethan had briefly met. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt, his hands trembling. He muttered incoherently, his words a jumbled mix of terror and despair. "The moon, it's coming," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's coming for us all." Ethan tried to calm him, but Caleb pulled away, his eyes filled with a desperate, animalistic fear. He fled into the encroaching shadows of the forest, disappearing as swiftly as he'd arrived. Ethan turned back to Abigail, a question hanging, heavy in the air. "The full moon," she said, her voice low. "It rises tonight, Dr. Blake. Tonight, Hollow Creek will remember its past." A cold dread crept into Ethan's heart, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. The sun began to set, and an unnatural stillness fell over the town, as if the very air held its breath, waiting. The full moon, a stark silver disk in the inky sky, cast long, distorted shadows across Hollow Creek. A palpable tension hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the terror to come. Ethan, despite his skepticism, felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The town, usually dimly lit, was now cloaked in an unnatural darkness, the inhabitants huddled in their homes, their windows dark, their breaths held. Then it came, a low, guttural growl that resonated through the valley, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of Blackwood Forest. It was followed by a howl, a chilling, mournful cry that echoed through the night, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was a sound that spoke of primal rage and insatiable hunger. Sheriff Brody's cruiser screeched to a halt in front of Ethan's house. "It started," he said, his voice grim. "Stay inside, Doc. Lock your doors." But Ethan couldn't stay put. He was a doctor, and something inside him, a mix of curiosity and a stubborn refusal to believe in the impossible, drove him to the edge of town, towards the tree line. The howl came again, closer this time, and he heard the sounds of panicked screams from the direction of the town square. He found Brody already at the scene, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sight that greeted them was horrific, a scene of carnage with overturned market stalls and blood staining the cobblestones. The townspeople that were caught outside were either missing or worse. "Caleb," Brody said, his voice tight. He was right in the middle of it. The ground was marked with strange, deep claw marks, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and something else, something musky and animalistic. A sudden movement in the shadows made them both raise their weapons. A figure darted between. Two buildings, too fast, too large to be human. "What was that?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Brody replied, his eyes wide. "But I'm sure as hell going to find out." Suddenly, a massive shape lunged from the darkness, its eyes glowing with feral intensity. A creature of nightmare, half man, half beast, its fangs bared, its claws extended. It was upon them in an instant, a whirlwind of fur and fury. Brody fired his weapon, but the creature seemed impervious to the bullets, its roar a deafening symphony of rage. It slashed at Brody, the force of the blow sending him crashing against a wall. Before Ethan could react, the creature vanished back into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror. Brody was alive, but badly wounded. "We need to get back to the station," he said through gritted teeth. "This thing, it's not natural." The brief encounter with the beast left Ethan's mind reeling. Rational thought was being pushed aside by the undeniable evidence of his eyes. Something terrible and impossible was hunting in Hollow Creek. Back at the sheriff's station, the flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows, amplifying the grim atmosphere. Brody, his arm bandaged and his face etched with pain and exhaustion, sat heavily in his chair. "We need to find out what we're dealing with," he said, his voice strained. "We need to understand this thing." Ethan, his mind still reeling from the encounter, agreed. The rational part of him screamed in protest, but the evidence was undeniable. They were facing something beyond the realm of normal understanding. "Abigail," Ethan said. "She knows the legends. She might have answers." They drove back to Abigail's house, the silence punctuated by the distant howls that continued to echo from the forest. Abigail, her face pale but resolute, welcomed them. Inside, she had already prepared a table with ancient-looking parchments and strange symbolic artifacts. "The Blackwood Curse," she began, her voice low and grave. "It is a tale as old as this town itself." She recounted the story of the first settlers, a group of desperate people seeking refuge in the untamed wilderness. They had made a pact with the spirits of the forest, promising to honor the old ways, to offer sacrifices in exchange for protection. But as the town grew, they forgot their promises, turning away from the ancient rituals. "The spirits were angered," Abigail said. "They demanded retribution. The curse manifested as a creature, a twisted amalgamation of man and beast, a vengeful spirit that hunted under the light of the full moon." "Caleb Holt," Ethan said. "He was involved, wasn't he?" Abigail nodded. "Caleb's family has a dark history. They are descendants of those who broke the pact. The curse has chosen him." She then showed them an old leather-bound book. This book was passed down for generations in this town. It holds some of the answers. Inside the book, there were disturbing images of rituals and transformations. The book speaks of a ritual, a way to appease the spirits, to break the curse, Abigail explained, pointing to a diagram of an ancient symbol. "But it requires a sacrifice, a life for a life." "A sacrifice?" Brody asked, his voice incredulous. "The spirits demand balance," Abigail said. "Only blood can quench their thirst." They found a page that seemed to show a drawing of the beast they encountered. "This creature, it is not merely flesh and blood. It is a vessel, a manifestation of the spirit's rage," Abigail said. Ethan looked closely at the drawing and recognized Caleb. "We have to find Caleb," he said. "He is the key to this." As the moon reached its zenith, a feeling of dread filled the small room. The time for answers was over. Now was the time for action. The revelation of Caleb's connection to the curse cast a grim pall over the small group. They understood now that the creature was not merely a mindless beast, but a vessel for something far more malevolent, something intimately tied to the town's dark past. "We have to find Caleb," Ethan reiterated, his voice urgent. "If he's the key, we need to find him before it's too late." Sheriff Brody nodded, his face grim. "All right, but we need to move fast. It's almost midnight." They ventured out. Into the night, the full moon bathing the town in an eerie, silver light. The howls had intensified, closer now, echoing from the depths of the forest. The town was a ghost of itself, silent and deserted. The only sounds, the rustling of leaves and the distant, haunting cries of the creature. They tracked Caleb's scent, a trail of fear and desperation leading deeper into the Blackwood forest. The trees loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches gnarled and twisted, reaching out like grasping claws. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Suddenly, a blood-curdling roar shattered the day. Silence. The creature emerged from the shadows, a towering figure of fur and muscle, its eyes burning with a feral crimson light. It was larger now, more monstrous, its transformation complete. It lunged at them, its claws extended, its fangs bared. Brody fired his weapon, but the bullets seemed to have little effect, merely glancing off the creature's thick hide. Ethan, armed only with a medical kit and his wits, dodged the creature's attacks, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature's movements were swift and powerful, its strength far beyond that of any natural animal. It seemed almost supernatural, a force of pure, unbridled rage. It ripped through the forest, the sounds of snapping trees and rending flesh echoing through the night. They retreated, the creature hot on their heels, its growls a constant menacing presence. They found themselves cornered in a small clearing, surrounded by the looming trees. The creature stood before them, its eyes fixed on Caleb, who was now bound to an old tree. The transformation was horrific to witness. Caleb's body contorted and twisted, his bones cracking, his skin stretching and tearing. Fur sprouted from his flesh, his face elongating into a snout, his hands and feet morphing into claws and paws. The creature's eyes glowed with an inhuman intensity, its roar a deafening symphony of pain and rage. The beast lunged and chaos erupted. Ethan felt an animalistic fear take over. This thing was no mere animal, it was a nightmare made real. The creature struck down a tree with ease. It was impervious to their weapons and filled with a rage that seemed to shake the very forest. Tonight, Hollow Creek would be baptized in blood. The monstrous creature, once Caleb, stood poised for the kill, its feral eyes locked on Ethan and Brody. Abigail's warnings echoed in their minds. A sacrifice, a life for a life. They knew then what had to be done. We need to get it back to the ritual site. Ethan shouted over the creature's growls, recalling the diagrams from the old book. That's where the curse is strongest. We have to draw it there. Brody, despite his injuries, nodded grimly. Lead the way, Doc. They retreated through the ravaged forest, the creature stalking them, its massive form crashing through the undergrowth. Ethan knew their only chance was to reach the ancient ritual site, a clearing marked by standing stones and a palpable sense of ancient power deep within the forest. It was a place Abigail had described as a nexus of the spirit's energy. As they reached the clearing, the creature lunged, its massive form a blur of fur and claws. Brody, using what strength he had left, fired his revolver, the bullets drawing the creature's attention. Ethan, meanwhile, scrambled to the center of the clearing, where a large, flat stone served as an altar. He remembered the ritual diagram, the specific arrangement of stones, the symbols drawn in blood, the incantation. With trembling hands, he began to recreate the ancient markings, using his medical kit as a source of sterile, if inadequate, blood. The creature, its attention divided between Ethan and Brody, was a whirlwind of savage fury. Brody, knowing he couldn't hold out much longer, yelled, "Do it now, Ethan!" Ethan finished the markings, his voice trembling as he recited the ancient incantation. The air crackled with energy, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The creature seemed to hesitate, its eyes flickering with a flicker of recognition, a hint of Caleb's humanity struggling to break free. Then the creature turned its gaze to Ethan, a low growl rumbling in its chest. It lunged, its claws outstretched, aimed at Ethan's heart. Before the beast could reach him, Brody stepped between them, taking the brunt of the attack. Brody fell to the altar, bleeding heavily, the creature's claws having pierced his chest. The ritual circle began to glow a bright blue. The creature wailed in pain, the light burning its flesh. The beast staggered backward and began to change back into Caleb. "I'm sorry," Caleb whispered, his voice weak and filled with remorse. The creature collapsed, its form shrinking, the transformation reversing. The blue glow intensified, then faded away. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by Ethan's ragged breaths. The cost of breaking the curse had been terrible and absolute. The first rays of dawn crept through the ravaged forest, casting a pale light on the scene of devastation. Ethan, his body aching, his mind numb, knelt beside Brody's lifeless form. The sacrifice had been made, the curse broken, but the cost was immeasurable. Caleb, now fully human again, lay nearby, his face etched with sorrow and guilt. I don't remember everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "but I remember the rage, the hunger, the darkness." Ethan helped Caleb to his feet, the two men moving like ghosts through the clearing. The ritual site, once a place of ancient power, now held an air of somber finality. The standing stones, once symbols of dread, seemed to stand in silent mourning. They made their way back to Hollow Creek, the town a ruin of its former self. Houses lay in charred fragments, and the once vibrant town square was a scene of desolation. The few survivors emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with shock and grief. Abigail Weaver met them at the edge of town, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and weary resignation. "The curse is lifted," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but the scars, they will remain." Ethan looked out over the ravaged town, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. The price of their salvation had been steep, a sacrifice that would forever haunt the town of Hollow Creek. The sheriff's station was destroyed, along with many other buildings. Ethan made his way to his Victorian house, where he cleaned his wounds and packed his belongings. He looked out of the window at the rising sun and the destroyed town. He knew he could not stay here. Too many bad memories. As Ethan prepared to leave, Caleb approached him. "Where will you go, Doctor?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "I'm not sure," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I know I can't stay here. Not anymore." Caleb nodded, understanding. "Hollow Creek will never be the same," he said, "but we will rebuild. We have to." Ethan nodded in return. The town would bear the scars of the night for generations, and the memories of the beast and the cost of stopping it would forever be etched into the souls of the townsfolk. The sun was fully up now, and Ethan began his walk away from Hollow Creek. He knew that the sound of the howling moon would never truly leave him.